Studying Recent History is an edited collection, and it's really a guidebook for historians who are interested in writing about the history of recent events. And we define recent events as anything that's taken place in the last 4 decades, although many of the scholars and the archivists in the book are talking about writing about events that have happened much more recently than that. And it's something that I think is really important for historians to think about. And a lot of historians have moved into writing about more contemporary history, recent events, in part because of the pressure of the market. There's a lure to be more what people might consider relevant and to talk about contemporary events. There's a lot of interest in talking about contemporary events, in part because more recent histories are there's a lot of interest in knowing about them, and having a historically grounded approach to them can be really fascinating for public readers. And it's something that we just see a lot happening, but yet when you look at historical methodology writings, there's almost no discussion of the ways in which writing about more recent events might differ from writing about far past events. And so we decided to put together this volume as a way to address some of the challenges and opportunities that scholars might face when they try to think about what doing more recent history might look like. And so the essays cover a wide range of topics. We look at some of the challenges from the fact that there's so many new kinds of sources for studying recent history that did not exist in the past, whether that's video games. One of the essays looks at how video games might be used as historical sources, how historians can use television programs perhaps more systematically than they might have, general issues of the glut of information that exists when you do more recent events. Many historians are trained to kind of go on a detective-like hunt for that source that's elusive. And when you write about the recent past, I know from my own experience, typically it's a very different experience. We have thousands of sources, and it's more about how do I wade through this and figure out how to use it systematically than how do I find the one needle in the haystack. There's issues related to lacking historiographies. Many historians are trained to go and read the existing historiography when you start a topic, and when you're tackling a topic where there is no existing historiography, you have to figure out now what do I do when other scholars haven't written about this. There's very little secondary literature. The scholarship that's in the field might be in political science, it might be in psychology, but it's not going to be written by historians. There's issues of positionality that arise. Recent events are more likely to be politicized, to be something that people consider they might be writing about because you have a particular agenda. And so historians have to be really careful about positioning themselves in relation to their material in ways they maybe don't think about as much in relation to further past events. There's also a real challenge of working with living subjects, which historians, there's long been oral history for historians, but many people who study recent events discover that they want to do an interview or two, they have absolutely no training in how to do that, and they don't really have the tools that an anthropologist might have when, as one of my co-editor writes about, when history talks back. Right, so what if you're interviewing somebody who wants you to tell their story in a particular way, is very invested in you telling that story in a particular way, but as a historian you realize that story they are telling you is only one version, and a particular version that needs to be contextualized within other information. And so thinking about the challenges that arise when history talks back to you, when you're talking to folks who are invested in their own experiences, and you need to figure out, how do I present this in a, how do I use this in historical research in a really systematic kind of way and methodological kind of way. So these are the kinds of issues we're exploring in the volume. Sources are a huge issue, as I've talked about, for people studying the recent past. And one of the most interesting things to think about is how we as historians adapt to new kinds of sources that didn't exist before. In graduate school, we're typically taught how to ask questions of archives, how to go into archives and think about what's there, what's not there, what might not be there because archives might collect more of the experience of elites, maybe don't have as much of ordinary folk. How do archives shape the knowledge that's out there? We don't have that same tools yet for asking about, let's say, search engines. So there's a lot of stuff out there on the internet, but it's mediated too. And how do we think about how that's mediated, what we can know? Let's say you want to study video games, and one of our essays looks at video games as sources and argues that for the 21st century, video games are as important a source as novels for the 19th century, right? Or TV for the 20th century. These are narrative sources. They are sources that have political ideologies embedded in them. They're very popular with certain segments of the population, but yet, They're really hard to use as sources. They're ephemeral. Game systems go in and out of style very quickly. So how do you find, let's say, a game from '86 that you can still play? Where do you go? But then also as a historian, how do you play a game, right? Do you have to learn the entire game to get through Worlds of Warcraft to see what the final stage is, which might be really telling? Do you do anthropological research and watch players who know how to play and just observe them? Like, what do you do? And so these are some of the kinds of questions and challenges that people are really thinking about in this volume and grappling with and exploring then the challenges but also the opportunities. Because one of the things we argue is that those who study the recent past, it's really exciting. It's exciting to do because to some extent you're often using untapped sources. You're often creating your own archive. If you're doing oral histories, you might be creating the archive that people might use after you if you do them in a legally responsible manner. You are working without a safety net, as one of our authors writes, right? You don't have the existing historiography, which can be scary, but is also exhilarating to be the first to write on a topic, to say these are the categories we should think about as important, even if maybe in the long term my interpretation won't hold up. In 40 years, it's really fun to be that first person to be doing that work. It's exhilarating because it forces you to be interdisciplinary. I think all fields have become more interdisciplinary, and certainly historical scholarship as well. But folks working in the recent past are using tools of anthropology, they're often using tools of sociology, often drawing on scholarship in a wide variety of fields. A lot of recent history turns out to be collaborative, and that was one of the interesting things we discovered. A lot of the essays in the book on Not Planned are collaborations written by more than one scholar. Working on recent history and on recent topics has made me really conscious of and cognizant of what is distinctive about historical methodology and the ways we look at the world, the ways we try to discover knowledge, the way we communicate that knowledge, and what that has to offer to people in a wide variety of fields. And I think particularly when we talk about the recent past, whether it's age policy, whether it's the age of Reagan, whether it's Obama's presidency, whether it's new technologies like the internet, those are often fields that can easily be politicized, that often are the site for myth-making, and that historians have a really important public role to play in providing historical background and context and scholarly understanding for things that people are really eager to know more about. And so those who take on this challenge and opportunity of writing about recent history can also play a really vital public role, and in a way that's really rewarding and fun as well.